The dining room glowed with gold-veined marble and crystal chandeliers as servers glided past tables like ghosts in white. At the center of it all sat the billionaire in a navy suit worth more than most cars. He tapped his cufflink twice and demanded the manager with the entitlement of a man who had never heard no. But when the young waitress approached instead and spoke with a voice so precise, so shockingly fluent in a dialect only native to the aristocratic circles of Vienna, the entire room shifted. He froze mid-sentence as if time itself had hiccuped. This girl, this voice, how did she know that language? And why did it sound exactly like someone he knew very well? The restaurant was soaked in quiet opulence, a stage set in velvet and marble, where each table flickered with candlelight, and every dish arrived like a jewel on porcelain. The air was warm with saffron and seared duck, soft jazz humming from a grand piano tucked beside a glass wall that framed the skyline like a painting. At the center of this golden hush sat the billionaire in tailored navy, cufflinks like frozen stars, and posture honed by a lifetime of owning rooms like this one. He barely glanced up when the young waitress approached. He had simply asked to speak to the manager and expected to be obeyed without question. But when she opened her mouth, speaking in flawless Upper Viennese German with a precision and rhythm reserved for nobles and diplomats, the room tilted, the air stiffened. Fawkes paused mid-air, his spine straightened as if pulled by memory. The dialect was not just accurate, it was intimate, laced with the echoes of a woman he had not heard in decades. His hand froze over the stem of his wine glass, and he turned to look at her fully now. Her hair was pulled back in the most unassuming way. Her apron was dusted with flour from the kitchen, but that voice, his lips parted, not to speak English but to respond in kind, an ancient tongue unlocked by emotion. His words were quiet, roughened with disbelief, as he murmured that she sounded exactly like his mother. Not just the dialect, the tone, the breath between syllables, the emotional cadence that no textbook could teach. It was as though she had walked out of a dream and onto the floor of a restaurant he only chose because it was near his hotel. She stood still, not smiling, not surprised, not smug, simply still. Her eyes never left his, but they held something unreadable, a quiet refusal to give anything away. The manager burst through the side door seconds later, cheeks flushed and voice scrambling in apology. The billionaire lifted a single hand without looking, silencing him with the same authority he used in boardrooms that decided the fate of companies. His gaze remained locked on the girl. He asked the manager one thing and only one thing: who is she now? But the waitress had already turned and walked away, her shoes making no sound on the polished floor. The kitchen doors opened before her and closed behind her with a slow, final sway, and just like that, she disappeared from view. He stared at the door long after it stilled, long after the room resumed its soft clatter and conversation. He had come for steak and privacy. But what he found instead was a voice that cracked the ice of his past and flooded it with something dangerously close to recognition, something he had buried with a name he no longer spoke. But that voice knew it. That voice remembered. The manager arrived in a rush of cologne and panic, his polished shoes squeaking faintly against the glossy stone as he skidded to the billionaire's table with napkin in hand and apology written across his flushed face. His voice stumbled over pleasantries and regret, but the billionaire didn't even blink. His hand hovered near his untouched glass, frozen not in irritation but in awe, as though his body had yet to catch up with the ripple that one voice had just sent through decades of carefully buried memory. He did not turn to the manager. He did not stand. He did not even acknowledge the nervous laughter of the nearby couple trying to disguise their curiosity with half-finished bites of foie gras. Instead, the billionaire lifted his chin just slightly and spoke in a tone honed over years of commanding mergers and dissolving dynasties with a signature. He said only this, "Tell me who she island now." The manager blinked, glanced toward the kitchen where the girl had vanished like smoke, and stammered something about staff rotations and short notice, and how she was new but sharp and humble, and spoke 5 languages fluently, though she had never gone to university. The billionaire did not react. His gaze was still fixed on that door, on the memory of that voice, replaying it like a fragment of an opera that used to make his mother cry in secret after dinner parties in Vienna. A table nearby quieted noticeably. Someone's phone camera tilted slightly toward the exchange, but it wasn't the billionaire who drew attention. It was the weight of his silence, the disbelief in his stillness. The power had shifted in the most unexpected direction, not through scandal, not through force, but through the tremble of a forgotten dialect and the composure of a girl in a $20 apron who had not flinched in front of a man who made heads of state hold their breath. The manager fumbled for more words, promising to get her file, to ask discreetly, to arrange a proper meeting. But the billionaire finally turned his gaze to the man and gave a small shake of his head. "Not now. Later. Then, quieter. Tell her I'll be back, and if she doesn't want to speak to me, tell her I will wait." The words were not a threat. They were not even a command. They were a vow spoken with the same reverence he once reserved for the woman whose voice now lived again in this stranger. The manager bowed his head and backed away, still unsure of whether a storm had just been averted or summoned. Around them the restaurant breathed again, but something had shifted. The guests knew it. The staff felt it. The billionaire no longer sat at the center of the room by virtue of his name. Now the gravity belonged to a waitress whose voice had opened something no money ever could. She didn't rush. Her steps were measured, like each one cost her something. As the weight of his stare burned into her back and the murmurs began to rise like steam from white plates and crystal flutes, she lifted a half-empty glass from the nearest table and moved to the next, with the grace of someone who had spent years mastering the art of invisibility. The tray on her hip was light, but her breath was tight beneath the collar of her blouse, and her fingers curled slightly against the linen napkin, as if it might anchor her to this moment before it unraveled completely. The hum of the restaurant resumed its tempo, but the air around her pulsed with a new rhythm. Not panic, not yet, but something close to dread wrapped in the echo of his voice, repeating one word in that old dialect like it belonged to a ghost. "Sophie," she swallowed, took another plate, smiled at a couple who complimented the lamb and asked if the chef was French. She nodded, said yes, said thank you, said let me clear this for you. But inside, she screamed. "You weren't supposed to notice me." Her feet carried her through the dining room with the elegance of routine, but every second that passed without being stopped felt like a borrowed moment. She passed the wine station, nodded to another server, slipped through the swinging kitchen doors that closed behind her with the hush of silk curtains drawn at the end of a play. The shift in atmosphere was immediate. Gone was the gold and chatter. In its place came the clatter of pans and the hiss of steam, the scent of truffle oil and burnt sugar. She set her tray down and pressed her palm against the cold edge of the counter. Her breath trembled. One cook raised an eyebrow but said nothing. She had done well, she knew that. The dialect had landed. The tone had been perfect. He had heard exactly what she wanted him to hear. But not yet. Not like this. Not here. She wasn't ready. The plan was never about confrontation in candlelight or recognition across risotto. She had come to study him, to observe from the shadows, to confirm what her mother's journal hinted at but never proved. She had not expected the truth to rush forward so soon and so loudly, and yet even now beneath the tremor in her chest was something else. Something steady, a thread of pride. He had recognized her. Not her face, not her name, but her voice. And that meant the connection was real. That meant the story had never been just a myth passed from mother to daughter in whispered lullabies and grief-soaked songs. That meant she had touched something sacred, but it also meant the game had changed and the next move would no longer be hers alone. The apartment was no larger than a train car and smelled faintly of dust, lavender oil, and ambition. Light poured in from a single window, filtered through thin curtains that once held color, but now hung like quiet ghosts. Every surface was layered with purpose. A chipped desk sagged under the weight of old language textbooks and faded maps of European cities lined with penciled notes. Beside it sat a record player surrounded by a halo of opera sleeves worn soft by years of careful use. On the floor, a dozen cassette tapes lay scattered like fallen dominoes, most labeled with dates and locations, but one stood alone. It was marked simply, in thick black ink, Mother. Anna sat cross-legged on the floor with headphones over her ears, a pencil poised in one hand and her lips barely moving as she echoed the phrases she heard. The accent was delicate, elevated, every syllable dancing with history and restraint. She repeated the lines over and over, adjusting breath, speed, tone, not just repeating, becoming. The voice in the recording was her mother's, younger and wiser than she ever seemed in life, instructing with both gentleness and urgency. You must speak as they speak. They will listen if you sound like them. Anna had heard that sentence so many times it lived in her bones now. She mouthed it again without sound, eyes closed. The walls around her might have been cracked and the heat unreliable, but this space breathed possibility. Pages covered in phonetic transcriptions were pinned above the desk, each note a clue, each margin scrawled with memories from stories her mother told between coughing fits and silences too heavy for a child to carry alone. A single photograph sat in a frame made from scrap wood, half hidden behind a stack of grammar guides. It showed a woman with wild curls holding a baby against a backdrop of cathedral towers. The woman's mouth was mid-laugh. Her eyes were defiant. Anna stared at it like it held answers she hadn't earned yet. She reached for the remote and rewound the tape slightly. Pressed play. Her mother's voice again. You are not nothing. You are not nobody. You have a name, even if he forgot it. Anna drew in a sharp breath and began mimicking the sentence with meticulous control. It wasn't about pretending. It was about preparing, about reclaiming something never acknowledged. Each word was an act of resistance, each phrase a brick in the foundation of something much larger than herself. She had taught herself the dialects of Austria, not for fun, but for truth. She had memorized courtly idioms and old-world lullabies, not because they were beautiful, but because they were all she had left of a story erased by wealth and cowardice. In this quiet room, filled with paper and static, she was building something he could not ignore, a voice that would echo not just in his memory but in every room he thought he controlled. The restaurant pulsed with quiet elegance as the dinner crowd thickened, each table a vignette of celebration or seduction, laughter swirling around imported wines and entrees that arrived like small miracles. But at the corner table where the billionaire remained long past the time he usually disappeared into town cars and private elevators, the air stood still. He had not touched his food. His fingers hovered over the rim of his glass but did not lift it. His eyes remained locked on the girl in the black apron, who moved from table to table as if the encounter had never happened. He watched how she carried plates with one hand and steadied trays with the other, how she smiled just enough to keep guests from remembering her face. But he remembered. Every tilt of her head, every soft syllable still rang in his mind like an aria unfinished. She passed near him again, and he raised 2 fingers with the ease of habit. She turned, approached. He said nothing at first, just studied her like a man peering through time. She poured water into his glass, and he saw it. The tremble, small, sharp, quickly suppressed. Her hand steadied as she reached for a bottle of wine and asked if he preferred the house red or the imported vintage. He chose without hearing. She poured, and finally he asked, "Your name?" The question hung there. She met his gaze with a calmness she had not yet earned, but knew she would need. Her lips parted, and she answered without hesitation, "Anna, just Anna." She could see something tighten in his posture, as if the name had collided with some memory he didn't want but couldn't deny. A single word, and already the ground between them cracked wider. Behind her, laughter burst from a group of tourists, snapping photos of dessert. To her left, a toddler screamed over dropped fries. A server tripped slightly near the bar. The entire restaurant moved in motion, but within this 4-foot radius time stilled. She began to step back, but he leaned forward, the movement small but full of gravity. He didn't ask again. He didn't need to. The pieces were clicking into place behind his eyes. Anna turned without another word and walked away. Each step measured, each breath counted, but inside her mind the echoes rang. He was watching, not just with curiosity but with recognition, like a man seeing something he had long forgotten was real. And that terrified her, because it meant he was thinking, digging, remembering. And once he remembered, she would no longer be just a voice that haunted him. She would be a question he had to answer, a past he had to face, and a future he could no longer ignore. The skyline blinked through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse office like a warning wrapped in luxury. All steel and silence, a cathedral of modern success built on secrets too old to be called rumors anymore. The billionaire sat in a leather chair that had been custom-stitched in Florence, but his posture was not one of comfort. He leaned forward over his desk, eyes flicking between a photo in his hand and a paused security feed from the restaurant displayed on the large screen across from him. There she was, frozen mid-step, tray balanced on her shoulder, eyes focused straight ahead. Anna. Just Anna. But he had seen too many names changed and too many legacies rewritten to believe in coincidence. Behind him hung portraits of his ancestors, their faces cold in oil and gold frames, watching him like silent jurors. On the desk lay a yellowed envelope containing a photo his mother had once hidden in the drawer she never thought he'd open. A woman with sharp eyes and curls that danced in the wind stood in front of a church in Vienna, holding a child to her chest. He whispered to himself, his voice roughened with something close to fear. "If she's who I think she is, everything changes." He didn't say it with hope. He said it like a man reading a prophecy etched into stone. At the far end of the room, his aide waited quietly with a tablet in hand. "Find her. Everything. Family. education, immigration, birth records. I want it all, tonight. The aide nodded and disappeared into the elevator, already dialing contacts that operated in quiet corners of archives and old bureaucratic ledgers. The billionaire remained seated, hands clasped, eyes dark with calculation and memory. The room smelled faintly of aged wood and the wine he hadn't touched. He pressed a button beneath the desk, and a panel slid open, revealing a locked drawer. Inside was a file folder wrapped in plastic and marked in a hand that was not his. He opened it slowly. Letters, clippings. A birth certificate with no father listed. A voice from the past whispered through each document. A life that had once collided with his own in a season of youth and recklessness. He had walked away from that chapter, told himself it was over, that the world demanded decisions and sacrifices. But now a girl stood in front of him speaking his mother's dialect with a voice so hauntingly precise it had cracked something inside him that all the decades and dollars had never truly sealed shut. He closed the folder and leaned back, the weight of old choices pressing into his chest like stone. Outside, the city glittered like a lie. Inside, truth stirred with the sound of her voice playing again in his memory, soft but sharp, like the end of an unfinished song. The next morning arrived gently, sunlight slipping through leaves like a secret, painting shifting patterns across the cracked stone path of the nursing home garden, where silence clung to the air like dust on old books. Anna sat on a weathered bench beside the only person who still tethered her to a life before questions and strategy. Her grandmother blinked at the birds in the feeder as if they were unfamiliar guests. Her shawl was falling off one shoulder, and her hands, spotted and trembling, rested on her lap with the stillness of someone who had forgotten how to chase time. Anna had changed into simple clothes, her apron folded neatly in her tote bag, her hair loose, her eyes ringed with exhaustion she could no longer hide. She placed a small blanket over her grandmother's knees and whispered a greeting in the dialect she had mastered not in school, but in moments like this. Her grandmother turned slowly, eyes squinting as if trying to place her face in some memory still flickering in the shadows. Anna repeated the greeting, this time softer, fuller, letting the vowels stretch like a lullaby. The old woman blinked once, twice, and then her expression shifted, not with recognition of a name or a moment, but of a sound. Her voice cracked as she reached out with trembling fingers and said with a kind of awe only the lost can offer, "You sound like her, my Sophie." Anna froze. The name swelled inside her like a wave too big to hold. Her mother, a woman who had died with too many truths swallowed whole. Anna nodded and smiled as her throat tightened. The old woman began to hum, something half-remembered and full of ache, a tune that had travelled from attic apartments to hospital beds, and now to this quiet garden where the scent of roses mingled with the sharp tang of forgotten lunches. Anna sat still beside her, holding her hand, watching her gaze drift back into the horizon of her mind, where names dissolved but voices endured. She wasn't doing this for fame or revenge. She wasn't chasing inheritance or headlines. She was chasing a memory, a truth, a voice that deserved to be heard and believed. Her mother had spoken of love turned cowardly, of promises made in soft rooms and broken in boardrooms, of a man with power and the fear to match it, and now that man had heard the voice of the girl he left behind not once but twice. Anna looked at her grandmother again, now humming louder, smiling as if the girl beside her might be the ghost of someone younger. Anna squeezed her hand and whispered again in the dialect that had become her weapon and her shield. She wasn't just reclaiming a legacy. She was resurrecting a story that no one else had dared to tell. The velvet curtains muffled the hum of the dining room beyond, cocooning the private booth in a hush that felt both intimate and charged, like the pause between lightning and thunder. The billionaire sat at the far end of the table, posture carved from patience and purpose, a bottle of chilled champagne untouched in its silver cradle beside him. The light above them was low and golden, brushing against crystal and linen with theatrical care. He had arrived unannounced, a reservation whispered into existence by reputation alone, and requested only one thing before he sat down. Her. Not as his server, not with a tray, just her presence. Anna had stood in the kitchen listening to the request relayed by a confused manager, her heart ticking in her chest like an old clock pulled too tight. She had every reason to refuse. Every instinct screamed to remain the shadow, not the storm. But silence had always served him, not her. So she wiped her hands, fixed her apron, and walked toward the booth, knowing each step folded deeper into a story she could no longer outrun. She entered the curtained space with a calm she manufactured breath by breath. He stood slightly, gesturing toward the seat across from him, and she slid into it with careful grace, her palms flat on her lap to still their tremor. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Outside the curtain, glasses clinked and laughter flared, but inside, the silence grew heavy with everything unsaid. Finally, he leaned forward, elbows on the table, eyes narrowed not in judgment but curiosity honed over decades of reading rooms and rivals. "Who taught you that dialect?" The question landed between them with no pleasantries to cushion it. She met his gaze, measured, steady. She could lie, say university, say a Viennese friend, but not yet, not here. She let the question hang like a chandelier with a missing chain, and replied with silence thick enough to echo. He studied her a moment longer, then leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable but his thoughts spinning fast behind his eyes. The champagne bottle sweated in its cradle, untouched, irrelevant. This wasn't a toast, it was a chessboard. He asked if she had family in Vienna. She said only that she had family who remembered it. He nodded once, slowly, like a man who had just heard a name whispered through fog. She could see the calculation in his face, the way his mind stitched memories to possibilities. But this wasn't just his game anymore. She was no longer waiting to be discovered. She had placed herself in the light, and she would speak only when she was ready. Until then, he could sit in his velvet booth and sip the bitterness of a question he might not be ready to hear the answer to. The rain began as a whisper against the tall windows outside the velvet-curtained booth, soft and rhythmic like fingers brushing over glass, each drop dissolving the city into watercolor shadows beyond the crystal stemware and porcelain plates left untouched between them. Inside, the silence stretched again, taut and deliberate. Anna sat still, legs crossed beneath the table, hands gently folded in her lap. But inside her chest something beat wildly, something ancient and fragile she could not afford to show. The billionaire's eyes remained steady on her, searching not for facts but for fault lines, the places where her calm cracked and gave way to something real. She knew this rhythm, knew how to bend it. So when she finally spoke, it was with the quiet authority of someone who had spent years preparing for this moment, but not expecting it to arrive in velvet and gold. She said she had studied linguistics, that accents were like fingerprints and dialects like time machines. that her fascination with the old aristocratic registers of Vienna came from a love of music and history, and a desire to hear how people used to speak before the world made them smaller. He raised an eyebrow, unconvinced, but said nothing. She pressed on, letting her voice dip slightly, just enough to pull him forward. "I like to listen to the dead. They speak more honestly." The line hung in the air like incense, too poetic to challenge, too heavy to ignore. He leaned back, temple resting on his knuckles, watching her with the scrutiny of a man who had trusted the wrong people before and learned that truth rarely walked through the front door. She sipped water, her throat dry but her expression composed. He asked nothing more for a moment, only looked, but the rain thickened now, tracing silver veins down the windows as if the sky itself was beginning to eavesdrop. Behind the curtain, the restaurant buzzed softly, dishes clinking, laughter rising and falling like a tide they no longer belonged to. Anna's mind raced behind her still eyes. She could feel the heat of memory pressing against the edges of her resolve. The photo, the journal, her mother's voice on the tape, the story she had carried folded in silence for so long it had almost become myth, but not yet. This man was not ready for the truth, and she was not ready to bleed for it. Not here, not tonight. So she offered fragments, hints wrapped in academic terms and metaphors that could be interpreted a dozen ways. Let him draw his own map for now. She would not lead him. Not until she was sure he could handle the terrain, and as she spoke of lost languages and tonal patterns from castles and kitchens alike, he nodded slowly, but his eyes never softened. He knew there was more. And she knew he knew. But mystery, like language, is a kind of power, and tonight she would keep both. The apartment breathed with shadows as the candle on the windowsill flickered in the quiet, its flame swaying to some unseen rhythm that made the peeling wallpaper seem alive and the worn bookshelves shiver like they remembered too much. Anna sat cross-legged on the wooden floor, knees drawn close, the torn journal balanced across her thighs like a relic from another life. The pages were yellowed, the spine cracked, ink faded in places by water or time or tears. Outside, the city exhaled in car horns and distant sirens, but inside the room, everything had narrowed to her mother's handwriting, curling across the paper in loops of defiance and regret. She traced the edge of one ripped page with her finger, then turned back to a passage she had read 100 times, the one she always returned to when the questions clawed too loudly in her mind. He heard my voice and ran. He feared what I knew. The words had been scrawled quickly, the pen pressed so hard it had torn slightly through the paper beneath. Anna swallowed. In the dim light, her mother's voice echoed as if the candlelight had turned it loose again. There had always been stories, half told between bedtime and hunger, stories about Vienna and wealth, and a man with power in his hands and fear in his heart. Her mother never named him, never cursed him, but she always returned to the voice. It was the voice he loved, the voice that scared him, the voice that proved she knew who he really was when the world only saw his charm. Anna closed the journal for a moment and pressed it to her chest, her eyes wet but not falling. Her grief had grown quiet over the years, not gone, just sharpened into something cleaner. Her mother had never asked for revenge. She had only wanted to be remembered, to have her truth heard by someone who could not pretend he hadn't lived it. The candle flickered harder, casting long shapes across the floor, and Anna opened the journal again. Flipping through it were recipes scribbled in margins, phonetic spellings of rare words, and pressed flowers brittle with age. Every page was a mix of memory and training, not just a diary but a manual. Her mother had been preparing her not for survival, but for return. A return to the place and man and silence that had erased them both. Anna looked up at the cracked ceiling, breathing slow, letting the memory wrap around her like a coat she'd never outgrown. The billionaire had run once, she knew that now, but he wouldn't run again. Not after hearing her. The voice was still there, sharpened, controlled, unmistakable. The story her mother wrote in whispers was no longer hiding in margins. It was standing in candlelight, speaking the truth aloud, and this time, someone would have to listen. The rooftop lounge stretched wide above the city like a quiet altar, wrapped in glass and shadow, where the sky bled orange into navy and the skyline shimmered beneath them like scattered diamonds tossed across velvet. The hum of conversation drifted around them, soft and polished, just background noise to the silence pulsing between Anna and the billionaire seated across from her. A soft breeze stirred the white linen draped across their table, and far below, the streets throbbed with life neither of them noticed. He sat with his jacket folded over the back of his chair, shirt sleeves rolled neatly past his elbows, the posture of a man who had surrendered control of the moment but not yet admitted it. His eyes were not on her but far beyond the glass barrier, searching something in the distance that only memory could show him. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, stripped of its usual armor. He said he had once lived in Vienna, before the money was this loud, before his name meant anything beyond a surname etched onto old mailboxes. He had been young then, reckless in ways that wore suits and laughed too loudly in concert halls. And there was a woman. Of course there was a woman. She had a voice that made him stop walking mid-sentence, a voice that wrapped itself around the cold marble of those halls and made them feel warm for the first time, a voice that could have belonged to royalty but never bowed to anyone. He looked at Anna now, his gaze not sharp but full of something closer to sorrow, and he said it slowly, carefully, like the words might break if said too fast. Her voice was like yours, exactly. Anna didn't move, didn't speak, didn't breathe more than necessary. She felt the words settle between them like snow, soft but undeniable. He went on. She was unlike anyone he had ever known. Brilliant, untamed. The kind of woman who read poetry in 3 languages and laughed like the world still had magic in it. They had spent months hidden inside music and moonlight, believing the world would make space for something honest. But when his father found out, the silence came fast. Threats, ultimatums, futures redrawn without room for her name, and he let it happen. He told himself he had no choice, that he would come back for her once the dust settled. But by then she was gone. Vienna was colder, and silence became the only thing he could afford to keep. He looked at Anna again, more gently this time, and said he had spent years trying to forget the sound of that voice because remembering it made everything else feel hollow. She was gone, and he had deserved that. But then you spoke, and I swear for a moment I thought the world had rewound. Anna held his gaze, unreadable, and said nothing. Not yet. Let him sit with the ghosts a little longer. Let him feel what it meant to finally remember. The restaurant after hours was a cathedral of silence, the usual clinking and chatter replaced by the hum of refrigeration and the distant groan of old pipes settling into stillness. Chairs were flipped upside down on tables, the floor freshly mopped and glistening under the glow of a single spotlight that spilled from the high ceiling like moonlight caught in glass. Anna stood beneath it, her apron gone, sleeves rolled up, her shoes quiet against the tile. The billionaire lingered near the bar, a drink untouched in his hand, posture half collapsed into the kind of weariness that only memory could summon. No one else remained. The staff had gone. The night had curled itself into quiet. She didn't look at him when she began to sing. No announcement, no build-up, just the first note, clear and low, threading into the air with a tenderness that made the walls lean in. The lullaby was simple, only a few lines, sung in the dialect her mother claimed was theirs alone, passed from mother to daughter like an heirloom too delicate for the world outside. The melody wasn't perfect, but the phrasing was, shaped by years of whispered repetition in small rooms full of love and absence. It was the song her mother sang when Anna had fevers, when the power went out, when the coughing wouldn't stop, and now it belonged to this space, this moment. Her voice rose slowly, not to perform, but to reveal, to test, and he failed immediately. The moment the second line slipped from her lips, his breath hitched, his glass tipped slightly, and then he froze. Every muscle caught in a past he had spent years paying people to forget. The sound cracked something open in him. His eyes found hers across the room, wide now, vulnerable in a way no boardroom had ever seen. His lips parted, as if to interrupt her, to ask how, to deny what he already knew. But he said only one word, not loudly, but with the reverence of someone naming the dead. Sophie. The name landed like a bell struck deep inside a cathedral, echoing through years of silence. Anna stopped singing. Let the last note hang a moment longer, then fade into stillness. The room exhaled. The spotlight hummed, and the truth stood between them with nowhere left to hide. He stepped forward once, slowly, as if unsure whether the floor would hold. But Anna didn't move. She didn't confirm. She didn't explain. She let the name sit there, not as a question, but as an answer he had finally spoken himself. The test was over, and he had remembered what mattered. The office was a temple of steel and silence, perched high above the city where the windows stretched from floor to ceiling like glass walls, holding back the weight of everything he had built. The furniture was sleek, sharp, almost clinical, all black leather and cold chrome, designed for decisions, not emotion. The light outside was grey and heavy with rain that hadn't yet fallen, casting shadows across the floor like cracks in a surface once believed to be unbreakable. The billionaire sat behind his desk, hands steepled, eyes locked on the file the courier had delivered 20 minutes earlier. He had known what it was before he opened it. Had ordered the test himself, quietly, with the kind of discretion that made inconvenient truths feel manageable. Just a glass of water she had left behind, just a single name typed in a form. But now the envelope lay torn open in front of him, and the line that mattered was marked in bold. Probability of paternity, 99.9%. His hands trembled, just slightly, as he closed the file and set it aside like something radioactive. Anna stood across from him, not seated, not softened, her arms folded, her jaw tight with fury barely held beneath the surface. She had not asked for this meeting. He had. And now she waited for him to speak, but there were no words grand enough to bridge what he had broken. He looked up at her, eyes hollowed by the gravity of a truth too long ignored. But before he could speak, she did. You left her. You left me. Her voice wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. Each word landed like a verdict. He flinched, Barely, but enough. She watched him with the clarity of someone who had rehearsed this confrontation in silence for years, built it from journal entries and lullabies and stories whispered through grief. He tried to speak, said he didn't know, said the timing, said the world, but none of it mattered. His empire filled the space around them, the weight of boardrooms and billion-dollar contracts and legacy carved into skyline. But right now, in this moment, all of it felt like insulation against a truth that refused to stay buried. She was his daughter. Not a theory, not a resemblance, not a haunting voice in a dialect half the world had forgotten. Flesh, blood, truth, and he had walked away before she could speak her first word. Anna didn't cry, didn't waver. She let the silence stretch until he understood that no apology could undo the abandonment written into her life. Then, without waiting for permission or a response, she turned and walked toward the glass doors. The soft click of her shoes echoed against the stone floor like punctuation. He remained still, surrounded by all his steel and success, and for the first time in years, he felt completely and utterly powerless. The boardroom was perched like a throne room in the clouds, its walls glass on all sides, offering a sweeping view of the city sprawling far below in grids of light and motion. Oblivious to the quiet battle unfolding above, the long table gleamed like a polished mirror, and behind it the billionaire sat alone, his reflection stretched and broken across the glossy surface. At the opposite end stood Anna, untouched by the grandeur around her, her arms by her sides, her face unreadable, her presence cutting through the silence like a drawn blade. Between them sat two folders, one closed and one open, both filled with numbers and names and contracts, designed to bury history beneath opportunity. He gestured toward them, his voice calm, composed, measured like every deal he had ever sealed. He spoke of legacy and restitution, of education paid in full, of travel, of introductions to people who decided the future over lunch, a seat on the board of one of his lesser ventures, an apartment with a view, access to everything the world once denied her. It was the offer of a lifetime dressed as redemption, but she didn't move, didn't even look down at the folder. Instead, she met his gaze and let the weight of her words settle in the room like fog. I didn't come for scraps. I came for the truth. His composure faltered just slightly, the faintest shift in his expression betraying how deeply he had miscalculated. He had offered what he knew: power, security, the golden staircase into rooms that denied her mother's existence. But Anna hadn't come to be made into something acceptable. She had come to make him remember, to make him account. She wasn't a daughter looking for approval. She was a reckoning. He opened his mouth to protest, to explain, but she cut the space between them with silence so sharp it forced him to stop. She reminded him not with words, but with her presence, of everything he had once chosen to forget. Her mother's name, unspoken in his home, her life, written out of the story. Her death, endured in a cramped apartment instead of a hospital with help. She stood now not as a girl rescued from obscurity, but as a woman who had clawed her way into the truth on her own terms. Outside the windows, the sky deepened, the last light pulling across rooftops like a curtain falling at the end of a performance. But this was no final act. It was a beginning. One not authored by him, not shaped by inheritance, but owned fully by her. He leaned back slowly, hands folded in front of him, understanding too late that the future no longer belonged to the version of himself who walked away. Anna turned then, walking to the glass wall, looking down at the city he ruled, and she saw it not as something to conquer, but something to change. And she knew she would. The cafe buzzed with morning energy, the scent of fresh espresso and cinnamon hanging in the air as baristas moved briskly behind the counter and commuters clutched paper cups like lifelines. But over by the window, where sunlight poured in thick and golden across the floor, a screen above the pastry case flickered with something that didn't belong to the calm hum of morning routine. The headline blared in sharp white letters over a split image of two faces, one familiar and poised in boardrooms, the other grainy and captured mid-shift in a black apron. Billionaire heiress found waiting tables. A woman near the counter gasped audibly, turning to her friend with a whispered rush. "Is that her? Could it be?" Anna sat 2 tables away, unnoticed for now, her hood drawn low, fingers wrapped around a mug she hadn't touched. Her heart beat slow but strong beneath the fabric of her coat. This wasn't a surprise. It was a spark she had struck herself. The journalist was a friend of her mother's from years ago, someone who owed more to the truth than to fear. And now the story had cracked open the surface of the world the billionaire had spent his life polishing smooth. Somewhere across the city, in a glass tower built on omission, he read the same headline, the paper crumpling slightly in his grip as the photograph stared back at him with the precision of a verdict. His phone vibrated. Again. Again. Board members, advisors, PR handlers. The legacy he had spent decades sculpting now had a face he could no longer keep in the shadows. And worse, the face looked like hers, like Sophie's. He paced the length of his private study, staring out over a city that suddenly felt foreign, as if it had turned against him while he slept. He had not been prepared. He thought she would take the offer, thought the truth could be locked quietly in a vault padded with comfort. But now the world had seen her, had given her a name. Not just daughter, heiress. Anna, meanwhile, closed her eyes briefly as the cafe around her grew louder with speculation. She heard someone read the headline aloud, saw a girl hold up her phone and zoom in on the image. And still, she remained still. Because this moment wasn't about being seen, it was about being impossible to ignore. She had not come for money. She had come to rewrite the silence. And now the first sentence had been written. Clear, public, irrevocable. Outside, traffic rolled by. Inside, the screen kept flashing the headline again and again, like a drumbeat. And Anna, for the first time since the lullaby left her lips, smiled, just slightly. Because the story was no longer his to control. The hall was carved from ambition, lined with towering marble columns and oil paintings that stared down with centuries of entitlement, their eyes frozen in judgments that never softened. The long table stretched through the center like a blade, polished to a ruthless shine, and around it sat the board. 12 men and women cloaked in bespoke suits and inherited confidence, their expressions sharpened by generational power. The room smelled faintly of cedar and old money, the kind that didn't speak loudly but always decided the final word. Anna stood at the far end, not seated, her posture straight despite the tension winding through her spine. The billionaire sat off to the side this time, not leading, not defending, watching like a man caught between 2 tides. She felt the weight of every stare on her skin, saw the calculations unfolding behind every pair of narrowed eyes. When the oldest board member leaned forward and spoke, his voice was low but edged with disdain. She has no pedigree, no schooling, no title, no seat at this table." The others murmured in agreement, some nodding, others studying her like a puzzle they resented having to solve. Anna swallowed hard, her pulse roaring in her ears, but her voice when it came was steady. She didn't ask for their approval. She didn't ask for permission. She told them what she carried, the truth, the bloodline, the silence she had broken with a voice they could not unhear. She told them her mother's name, her story, the cost of a secret buried to protect comfort. The walls didn't shake. The portraits didn't weep. But something in the room shifted. A few eyes flicked toward the billionaire. He remained still, jaw tight, eyes unreadable. Anna saw the doubt in their faces, the unwillingness to imagine a world where legacy could be earned without being bought. But she also saw fear, not of her, of what her presence represented, a fracture in the narrative, a crack in the marble. She lifted her chin and told them she wasn't going anywhere, that the story had already begun and the public was already listening, that what they did in this room would not be buried in policy or backroom silence. And though her voice wavered once, just once, it did not break. Because she was not just her mother's daughter, she was the truth they had spent years avoiding. Outside, the sky was grey. Inside, the portraits watched the girl with no pedigree stand taller than any of them had expected. The board whispered among themselves, retreating into consultation, but Anna knew this was only the beginning of the real war. She had stepped into the lion's den not as prey but as proof, and whatever came next, they would not forget her name. The grand conference hall pulsed with tension, its vaulted ceiling and cascading chandeliers trying in vain to soften the sharpness of what was unfolding below. The air buzzed with anticipation, the kind that lives just before verdicts and revolutions. Every seat was filled. Shareholders, reporters, board members, rivals, their gazes fixed on the lone figure standing at the front, framed not by marble or pedigree, but by something far more dangerous, truth. Anna stood poised at the podium, back straight, breath steady, the silence before her like a current waiting to be broken. Cameras blinked red in the distance, pens hovered above notebooks. The billionaire sat off to one side, silent, still, a storm bottled inside a tailored suit. She looked out over the room, not with arrogance, but with clarity, her eyes sweeping across generations of wealth and denial. And then she spoke, not loudly, not angrily, but with the fire of someone who had waited her entire life to be heard. She began with the story, not the one in the headlines, but the one hidden in hospital rooms and handwritten journals. She spoke of her mother, of the woman who had raised her with music and memory instead of wealth, of lullabies sung in fading dialects, of a childhood spent learning not to be bitter but to be ready. She told them how her mother had never asked for anything, only that her story not be erased. Then she shifted, her voice sharper now, precise. She told them of Vienna, of a love abandoned for convenience, of promises broken with silence, of a name never given to a daughter who carried every syllable of that man's voice. She didn't spare the details. She didn't hide behind humility. This wasn't revenge. It was reclamation. And when the air grew thick with discomfort, when the room squirmed under the weight of its own complicity, she said the words that cracked the floor beneath them. "I am your blood, but I am also my mother's fire." A hush fell so complete it felt like the chandeliers had stopped breathing. She looked toward the board, toward the men and women who still clutched their titles like shields, and she told them they could deny her seat, but not her story. They could reject her lineage on paper, but not in truth. That every attempt to erase her would only make the world look closer. Behind her, a screen flickered silently through images. Her mother's photograph, the DNA report, the headline, the portrait of the billionaire beside a younger version of the woman he once left behind. And then, as if the weight of the truth had pulled gravity itself, the audience began to shift, not loudly, not dramatically, but meaningfully. A head nodded, a camera zoomed in, a whisper passed like wind through dry leaves. Power was moving, and it was moving toward her. The private chamber sat high above the city like a hidden heart inside the tower, its glass walls stretching wide to reveal the skyline wrapped in dusk, the lights below flickering like a heartbeat slowly stabilizing. The room was quieter than the boardroom, stripped of performance and posturing, its furnishings minimalist but expensive, the kind of space where only final decisions were spoken. Anna stood near the window, her reflection a faint silhouette against the deepening night. Behind her, the board had retreated, their silence an unspoken surrender to the weight of facts they could no longer twist or bury. She had expected resistance. She had braced for denial, but the evidence had spoken louder than bloodlines ever could. Across the room, the billionaire remained seated, hands folded, eyes trained on the surface of the long polished table where her mother's name had finally been said aloud without shame. There was a weariness in him now, but not defeat, something closer to reckoning. He gestured for her to sit, and after a long pause, she did. No staff remained, no cameras, just truth and its echo. He cleared his throat, the silence between them thick with things neither of them would say again. He told her the board had met privately, that while they couldn't erase the past, they couldn't deny the future either. They had proposed a compromise. She would be offered a seat equal to his. Not a ceremonial gesture, not a handout, a position of power earned through fire. Then, slowly, he looked up and met her gaze, the weight of years behind his eyes. Co-chair. Legacy earned, not given. Anna did not speak at first. Her breath sat tight in her chest, her fingers curled slightly in her lap. She had imagined 1,000 versions of this moment, and none of them looked like this. Quiet, steady, real. Not victory but recognition, not applause but accountability. The kind that doesn't erase damage but begins to repair it. She nodded once, slowly. She didn't say thank you. This wasn't gratitude. This was acknowledgement. Across the table, the billionaire exhaled as if some part of him had been waiting for this decision longer than he had realized. Outside, the skyline stretched endlessly, the buildings below glowing with artificial constellations, unaware that a dynasty had just shifted without a single headline. Anna stood again, steady now, taller than before. She moved to the window, looked down at the city her mother had once been exiled from, and saw not distance, but possibility. The past had been written in silence and shame, but the future would speak her name clearly, and this time the world would listen. The nursing home garden rustled with the soft hush of autumn, leaves swirling in gold and rust around the stone benches, as if the season itself had come to offer a gentle benediction. The sun hung low, casting a warm amber glow through the thinning trees, and the breeze carried the faint scent of chamomile and turning earth. Anna walked slowly along the path, a paper bag of pastries tucked beneath her arm, her coat fluttering slightly as she approached the same bench where she had sat countless times before. Her grandmother waited there, bundled in a thick scarf, her frail hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes closed, her face tilted toward the sun like a flower that still remembered how to bloom. Anna sat beside her without speaking, simply resting the bag between them, listening to the rustle of leaves and the quiet breath of the old woman beside her. Moments passed like soft waves before the older woman stirred and turned, her gaze slowly focusing. Recognition came not with words, but with a small, knowing smile. Her voice, when it finally came, was no stronger than a whisper, but it carried the weight of generations. Sophie would be proud. The words landed like a blessing, as if they had waited in her lungs for years just to be spoken now. Anna felt her throat tighten, her eyes welling not with grief, but with a long-awaited sense of peace. She reached for her grandmother's hand and held it gently, her thumb brushing over paper-thin skin, grounding them both in the warmth of that moment. She whispered back, more to the wind than to the woman beside her. She never stopped loving him, not even when he forgot her name. Her grandmother gave a small nod, a tear slipping quietly down her cheek, and Anna leaned in, pressing her forehead softly to the older woman's temple. They sat like that, the two of them surrounded by leaves and light, breathing in silence and memory. The city felt far away. The boardrooms, the headlines, the tower of glass and steel. All of it faded against the real truth that pulsed here between a granddaughter and the last witness to her mother's song. Anna did not need to explain what had happened. Her grandmother did not need to ask. They both knew, and in that knowing, something heavy lifted. The legacy was no longer lost. The story had been returned to the hands of the woman who had once sung it into existence. Anna looked out at the trees, the sunlight dancing across the branches, and for the first time in years, she felt still, not paused, not hiding, but truly still. There would be more battles, more questions, more eyes on her every step, but this moment was hers, and it was enough. The restaurant glowed with mid-morning light, sunlight pouring through the stained glass panels that had once cast soft colors on her apron and shoes, now stretching across linen and polished silverware like a quiet celebration. The tables were mostly empty this early, the hum of the city still gathering pace outside, but inside the space felt different, brighter, slower, as if it too recognized the shift in her presence. Anna stepped through the entrance not in uniform, not with a tray or schedule or task, but as a guest. Her coat was draped over one arm, her stride easy, her expression calm in a way that had nothing to do with performance. A few heads turned, whispers passing between servers who pretended not to look. One nodded discreetly to another. "Is that her?" She sat near the window, the same table the billionaire had once claimed like a throne, and crossed her legs with grace that had always been there, now simply noticed. Her gaze moved over the room, familiar and distant all at once. The menu sat folded before her, untouched, unnecessary. She had come not to eat, but to mark something, a circle closing, a truth no longer hidden behind someone else's name. A young waiter approached, fidgeting slightly, his apron too long and his smile tentative. He offered water and apologized quickly. "The manager's off today. Can I help you?" Anna smiled, not out of amusement or condescension, but with genuine kindness. the kind that acknowledged he was where she had once stood, balancing pride with caution. She nodded and thanked him, accepting the water as though it were wine, and leaned back into her seat. The morning light touched her skin gently. The chair beneath her did not feel like a stranger. She didn't belong to the world behind the swinging kitchen doors anymore, but neither had she abandoned it. She had grown from it, risen through it, and now sat between two worlds with the quiet certainty of someone who had earned her place without needing to explain how. Across the room, two servers whispered again, glancing at her, one mouthing her name like a secret too beautiful to say aloud. She didn't look away, didn't hide. She let them see her, all of her. Not the myth from headlines, not the heiress born in scandal, but the woman who had once bussed their tables and walked home counting tips like prayers. Outside, the street stirred to life, but inside the restaurant, the moment stretched long and still, as if the room itself had paused to watch her reclaim it, and in that quiet, Anna smiled. Not because she was being seen, but because she no longer needed to disappear. The apartment was quiet, the kind of quiet that didn't ache anymore, but settled like a blanket over familiar things. The stacked books, the aging record player, the faded photo still propped against the window pane. The late afternoon light slanted through the blinds in long golden stripes, casting soft warmth over the floor, as Anna sat cross-legged beside the small table where so many pages of her mother's journal had once lived. A knock had come earlier, soft and brief, followed by the sound of footsteps retreating down the hall. When she opened the door, a box waited. No name, no return address, just simple brown paper and a folded note tucked beneath the twine. She brought it inside and sat with it for a long moment, fingers brushing the edge without opening, as if touching memory itself. Then slowly, carefully, she untied the twine and lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in velvet, was the locket. Oval, gold, worn at the edges, unmistakable. The same locket her mother had described on nights when the memories were stronger than the pain. The locket, she said, had been given to her in secret, then taken without explanation. Anna's fingers trembled as she reached for it, the chain cool against her skin, the clasp delicate but still intact. Beneath it, a folded note rested like a whisper waiting to be heard. She opened it and read the line written in clean, slanted ink. "I was a coward, but I see you now." She sat back slowly, the locket in her palm, the paper light as ash, her breath caught, not with sorrow this time, but with something more fragile. Forgiveness, not offered fully, not yet, but flickering like the first light beneath snow. He had sent no apology, no excuse, just the truth he had never spoken aloud. And now it lived here, in this room filled with her mother's voice and her own stubborn fire. She held the locket to the light, watching it catch the gold in the slanting sun, and wondered how many years had passed since it last rested in a hand that loved without permission. Slowly, she unclasped the chain and fastened it around her neck, letting the weight settle over her heartbeat, not as closure, but as connection. Outside, the city hummed through open windows, and inside the silence shifted into something gentler. A door had opened, not wide, but enough. Enough to breathe, enough to remember, enough to forgive. And as Anna sat there, the locket warm against her skin, she understood that some things were never really lost, only waiting. Dawn spilled slowly across the city like a promise, its first light stretching over rooftops and glass towers, brushing the world awake with gold and silence. In a studio above the street, where the windows faced east and the walls were lined with books, maps, and ideas not yet born, Anna stood at a table flooded with morning. Her hands moved with calm certainty, arranging documents, sketches, and letters, all laid out beneath the soft glow of a single pendant lamp. At the center of the table sat a blueprint, crisp and precise, its title scrawled in bold ink across the top, the Sophie Institute for Arts and Memory. Beneath the name flowed rooms designed not for profit, but for potential. Theaters, classrooms, community spaces where voices that had been dismissed, overlooked, or silenced would be nurtured and heard. Next to it, she placed the locket, its chain coiled neatly, gleaming in the light, no longer a relic of sorrow, but an emblem of return. Her fingers lingered over it, then moved to the edge of the blueprint, pressing gently, as if to seal the moment into reality. Behind her, the skyline began to glow. The world she once served coffee to now looked very different. It was not a place to infiltrate. It was a space to transform. The phone on the table buzzed once with a meeting reminder. Funding had been approved. The board had voted, doors would open, and this time it would not be behind a velvet curtain or glass wall. It would be through the front, with her mother's name carved in stone. Anna took a breath and looked out the window as the sun lifted over the horizon, painting the city in soft light and clean lines. Her reflection in the glass was still, not small, not loud, but certain. The voice she had trained for years, the one they all once ignored, now echoed in boardrooms and hallways and court filings. But this institute was something more. It wasn't a monument. It was a beginning, a way to pass the voice forward, to teach others how to speak the language of the unseen. And as she turned from the window, the camera of the world slowly widening, a quiet voice rose like wind over strings. Not her own, but somehow still hers. Sometimes the voice they ignored becomes the one that rewrites everything. If this story moved you or made something in you sit up and listen, give this video a like and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. It helps us share more stories that celebrate hidden voices and untold legacies. Make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next chapter in someone's journey toward truth. And if you know someone standing quietly at the edge of their own moment, share this with them. Sometimes all it takes is one voice, one memory, one impossible conversation that finally says, "You belong here." Thank you for being part of this story.